I want to thank all of you for being here for this town hall about what I think is probably one of the most pressing issues of our entire time.
But it was this idea that the government existed to serve the citizens, not the other way around.
But so we can remind Canadians that you have been always the lions.
Why, as a nurse recently asked, do the protected need to be protected from the unprotected by forcing the unprotected to use the protection that did not protect the protected in the first place?
And I tell you what, when the government gets out of their lane, sparks fly. Get back in your lane.
Mainstream media, all the governing parties and all the opposition parties are in unanimity here. No media, no lawyers, no law professors, no academics, no professors, no courts. Not a single judge in this whole country has stood up for this in 2 years.
Back it up with the facts. You saw me night after night, if you ever watched, with the documents, and I say, here they are.
Today, these freedoms are not just threatened, they've been taken from us.
Limited government is what allows people to prosper. And yet in every country, government grows.
Politics should be the least important part of most people's lives. The least important.
What they fail to realize is really they're being used as pawns by these elites.
Every power that the government takes, it will never relinquish voluntarily.
But I think it's time to take action over this beautiful country we call Canada.
Some folks here, I think, are from the Democracy Fund, but many people here have come to hear Conrad Black in what I think is going to be a very important speech. For decades, civil liberties was owned by the left. Most of the people who were fighting freedom of expression seemed to be liberals or leftists. And then that sort of faded away. And those same liberals and leftists today are the ones promoting cancel culture, the ones cheering on the lockdown, locking churches and businesses, telling you who you can and can't have in your own homes. Doesn't sound very liberal to me. And I think one of the reasons is because we've forgotten as a culture and we've forgotten as a country that Canada has a history of civil liberties. You heard Mark say that the Democracy Fund has several mandates under the Canada Revenue Agency charitable status. One of them is to fight for constitutional rights in the court of law. But another one is to make that fight in the court of public opinion through education. And I think that if we're going to avoid another civil liberties bonfire like we've had for the last 2 years, it's not enough just to say, okay, we're done with it. We have to examine it. What went wrong, and to remind people that Canadians believe in civil liberties too, and it's not just a recent thing. For centuries, that is our tradition, and who better than a great historian, a great writer, and a great Canadian, someone who cares very deeply about this country. I was so delighted when Conrad Black accepted the position as the historian in residence for the Democracy Fund with that important mission: remind Canadians of our true history, remind them that freedom is not just for Americans, it's for us. And what a great pleasure it is for me to call to the stage and introduce to you my friend, a man who has done so much for Canadian journalism, so much for Canadian history, a great author, a great thinker, Conrad Black.
Thank you very much for your welcome.
I can't see you with these bright lights, but I hear you. I fear I may be the victim of having been somewhat over-anticipated. To the man who said to me in the reception outside that he'd come to hear my jokes, see me afterwards and I'll give you a refund. The history of civil rights in Canada is a worthy one, but it is no barrel of laughs. I'll leap right into it. The ravages of age here. Civil rights were not a burning issue when Canada was primarily the French colony of New France. The purpose of New France was entirely commercial and essentially based on the fur trade. Until Jean Talon created industries that made New France self-sufficient. And to raise the population, he imported 1,000 nubile young French women. And today, approximately 7 million French Canadians and Franco-Americans are descended from them. Only at this point, about 75 years after it was founded, did New France develop a rudimentary legal and judicial framework. 80 years later, when the British captured Quebec City and Montreal in the 7 Years' War, a gentle form of British military rule ensued. A small English-speaking population arose, chiefly composed of commercial sharpers from the American colonies, claiming to be performing a useful purpose, but in fact exploiting the local population. Colonel James Murray became the first English civil governor of Quebec in 1764. A royal proclamation had foreseen an assembly to govern Quebec, but this was complicated by the fact that at the time, British law excluded any Roman Catholic from voting for or being a member of any such assembly. And accordingly, the approximately 500 English-speaking merchants in Quebec, mainly Americans, demanded an assembly since they would be the sole members of it. Murray liked the French Canadians and despised the American interlopers as scoundrels. He wrote of them, "In general, they are the most immoral collection of men I have ever known." He described the French in Quebec as a frugal, industrious, moral race of men who greatly appreciate the mild treatment they have received from the king's officers. Instead of facilitating creation of an assembly that would just be a group of émigré New England hustlers and plunderers, Murray created a governor's council, which functioned as a sort of legislature, and he packed it with his supporters and sympathizers of the French Canadians. The greedy American merchants of Montreal and Quebec had enough influence with the Board of Trade in London, a cabinet office, to have Murray recalled in 1766 for his pro-French attitudes. He was a victim of his support for the civil rights of his subjects, but was replaced by the like-minded next governor, the very talented Sir Guy Carleton, Lord Dorchester. Murray and Carleton had both been close comrades of General Wolfe. The principal early controversial legal case in the colony spanned the terms of both men. It was a peculiar episode in which one of the most bigoted and authoritarian of the magistrates, Thomas Walker, was assaulted in his home while having dinner with his wife, and part of his ear was severed. Murray disapproved of this naturally, but did not consider the incident to have been entirely unprovoked. Carleton had to deal with the allegation of a discharged soldier, George McGovick, against the alleged intruders and despoilers of Walker's ear. In a spectacular trial, it appeared that McGovick was not just a perjurer, earning a conviction for perjury after the accused were acquitted, but that he had colluded with Walker, his former landlord. The trial was largely a French versus English, Catholic versus Protestant contest. French public opinion naturally was against Walker, who was eventually jailed by Carleton, rescued by Americans, and fled back to Boston. The whole drama vastly raised British popularity and satisfied many French Canadians that they could count on English support against the overbearing Americans. The British had doubled their national debt in the 7 Years' War, and the largest expenses were incurred in expelling the French from Canada. And the urgent request of the principal American agent in London, Benjamin Franklin, largely prompted this. As the Americans were the most prosperous of all British citizens, and the goal was to accommodate their wishes, the British naturally thought it appropriate that the Americans should pay the stamp tax that their British cousins were already paying. The French Canadians had no objection to the stamp tax, even though it paid for the expulsion of France from Canada. As Murray and Carleton foresaw, the British were not able to collect that tax from the Americans. British soldiers would be little motivated to fight their American kinfolk, and now that the Americans didn't have a neighboring French presence to worry them, they could certainly be tempted to revolt and would be very hard to suppress. As Murray and Carleton also foresaw, the only chance the British would have of retaining Canada and preventing the French Canadians from rallying to the Americans would be if the British Crown became symbolic in the mind of French Canada with the survival of the French language and culture and religion. Carleton concluded that to retain Quebec's loyalty, Britain would have to make itself the protector of the culture, the religion, and also the civil law of the French Canadians. From what little they had seen of it, the French Canadians much preferred the British to the French criminal law. In pre-revolutionary France, there was no doctrine of habeas corpus, and the authorities routinely tortured suspects, particularly on the rack. In a historically very significant act, Carleton effectively wrote up the assurances that he thought would be necessary to retain the loyalty of the colony. He wanted to recruit French-speaking officials from among the colonists to give them as much self-government as possible, while judiciously feeding the population a worrisome specter of assimilation at the hands of a tidal wave of American officials and commercial hustlers in the event of an American takeover of Canada. After 4 years lobbying nonstop in London, Carleton gained adoption of the Quebec Act, which contained the guarantees he thought necessary to satisfy French Canada. He returned to a grateful Quebec in 1774. The knotty issue of an assembly, which Quebec had never had and was not clamoring for, was ducked, and authority was vested in a governor with an executive and legislative council of 17 to 23 members chosen by the governor. Conveniently, the liberality accorded the Roman Catholic Church was furiously attacked by the Americans, who in their Revolutionary Continental Congress reviled it as, this is a quote, a bloodthirsty, idolatrous, and hypocritical creed, a religion which flooded England with blood and spread hypocrisy, murder, persecution, and revolt into all parts of the world. The American revolutionaries produced a bombastic summary of what the French Canadians ought to do and told them that Americans were grievously moved by their degradation, but warned them that if they did not rally to the American colors, they would henceforth be regarded as inveterate enemies. This incendiary polemic was translated, printed, and posted throughout the former New France by the Catholic Church and the British government acting together. The clergy of the province almost unanimously condemned the American agitation as xenophobic and sectarian incitants to hate and needless bloodshed. Carleton astounded the French Canadians, who were accustomed to the graft and embezzlement of French governors, by not taking any payment for his service as governor. It was entirely because of the enlightened policy of Murray and Carleton's skill and persistence as a lobbyist in the corridors of Westminster that the civil and cultural rights of the great majority of Canadians 250 years ago were conserved. The Americans, when they did proclaim the revolution in 1775 and officially in the Declaration of Independence on July 4 of 1776, made the British position in Canada somewhat easier by their virulent hostility to Catholicism and to the French generally. The indomitable Benjamin Franklin and the still loyal revolutionary Benedict Arnold were rebuffed when they tried to entice and bully the French Canadians to rally to the Americans. Carleton, by the narrowest of margins, and after masquerading as a civilian to avoid capture, evicted the American intruders from Canada. He did so because of his championship of the rights of the French Canadians 20 years earlier, a subject people. Despite the immense fanfare of the American claim to bear the standard of human freedom, Canada's civil rights record was in fact better than the American, and was well illustrated by Carleton's refusal at the end of the Revolutionary War to hand over to General George Washington 3,000 American slaves who had joined the British forces. Instead, they were given passage to the British West Indies and their emancipation was confirmed. This was just the beginning of extensive Canadian assistance to American slaves and abolitionists. A significant number of Americans who were loyal to Britain and despised the American Revolution moved to Canada during and in the decades after the Revolutionary War. And as the number of English Canadians steadily increased along the Great Lakes and west of the Ottawa River, Carleton created what became the province of Ontario, Upper Canada, in 1791. The first Lieutenant Governor, John Graves Simcoe, devised and implemented an ambitious program of enticing Americans to Canada by effectively giving them rich farmland. The population of English Canada rose swiftly toward a parity with the French. In 1792, Simcoe took it upon himself to abolish slavery in Upper Canada 42 years before it was abolished in the British Empire and 71 years before the United States. It was an admirable and pioneering endeavor in the principal area of civil rights controversy in North America in the coming century. Unfortunately, as the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars unfolded, the British could not resist the temptation to deploy their mastery of the high seas to impose blockades and harass the shipping of neutral powers. The young United States did not have the military force to deter such treatment, and in 1812, those countries went to war. Canada was the blameless focal point of most of the fighting. Canada, with the continuing solidarity of the French Canadians, was able to mount a very solid defense. The many thousands of recently arrived Americans did not support the United States, and the generous policy of enticing settlement from the United States was completely vindicated. There were pressures to expel them, monitor them, disqualify them from holding local offices and positions. But it was soon agreed that they could become citizens after 8 years of residency. This affected about 40% of English Canadians, and this must count as another very successful chapter in Canada's early record of respect for civil and human rights. As reasonably successful wars do, considerable national sentiment was created and encouraged by the successful joint struggle to avoid American occupation. Out of these experiences came increased ambitions for democratic self-rule in domestic matters, as the British and Americans enjoyed, instead of autocratic rule by British governors. Canada's position was complicated by the fact that it could not agitate for home rule too energetically, or the British would lose patience and sell Canada to the United States for cash or other territory, or for a comprehensive alliance. Outright rebellion was not an option for Canada as it had been for the Americans, as the United States would seize Canada if it were not under British protection. The Canadian solution for agitating but not completely exasperating Great Britain was the Gilbert and Sullivan rebellions of 1837, led by William Lyon Mackenzie in Ontario and Louis-Joseph Papineau in Quebec. The Ontario uprising was just a rowdy group of malcontents who became disorderly and were easily chased off. And the French-Canadian group were essentially pamphleteers, though there were some exchanges of fire and small rebel and military units marched to and fro in poor winter weather. A total of about 300 people died. There were 14 executions and 92 people were transported as prisoners to Australia. The rebel leaders fled but were eventually pardoned and returned. There was enough commotion to get Britain's attention, but the loyalty of most of the population gratified the British, and they determined to put things right. London sent the well-known reformer Lord Durham to Canada in 1840 to make recommendations. After a year of research by a couple of biased examiners, Durham came to the insane conclusion that the source of Canadian discontent was that the French Canadians wanted to be relieved of the intolerable burden of being French. Durham proposed uniting Upper and Lower Canada and assumed that the slight resulting English minority would assimilate the French in about 10 years. Of course, this was precisely what the French feared, and the English Canadians had no desire for it either. But after several years of rearguard action by British governors, the movement for autonomous government succeeded after the 25-year-old Queen Victoria sent Lord Elgin to Canada as governor to give the Canadians what they wanted. Elgin and Robert Baldwin and Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine achieved this and secularized a great deal of territory owned by the principal churches so that they could be more easily settled, and made the principal universities officially non-denominational. These were again great and nonviolent steps in the civil rights of Canadians, who now numbered over 2 million. All of North America was now walking on eggshells over the immense problem of American slavery. Slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire in 1834. In practice, there had not ever been more than a couple of hundred slaves in Canada, apart from the natives enslaving each other. Slaves had been imported to the southern states because of their efficiency at harvesting tropical crops such as cotton. So Canada was effectively spared that horrible institution because of its climate more than its virtue. Canada had a fine record in accepting about 40,000 fugitive slaves that reached the Canadian border in the 30 years before the US Civil War. The leading American anti-slavery advocates, Harriet Tubman and John Brown, and Josiah Henson, the model for the chief character in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which sold an unheard of 2 million copies in the 1850s, all lived in Canada for years. There were at least 11 Black Canadian doctors who were fugitive slaves or sons of fugitive slaves who served in the Union Army in the Civil War. And the white Canadian anti-slavery activist, Dr. Alexander Ross, at the request of President Lincoln, assisted in breaking up a Confederate spy ring in Montreal. Escaped slave Joseph Taper of St. Catharines wrote this letter back to his former and still putative owner in 1839. I now take this opportunity to inform you that I'm in a land of liberty, in good health, in the Queen's dominions. Man is as God intended he should be. All are born free and equal, not like the Southern laws which put man on a level with brutes. All the colored population is supplied with schools. My boy, Edward, who will be 6 years next January, is now reading, and I intend to keep him at school until he becomes a good scholar. My wife and self are sitting by a good, comfortable fire, happy, knowing that there are none to molest us or make us afraid. God save Queen Victoria. As many as 40,000 Canadian volunteers served in the Union Army in the Civil War, and Canada was thanked on several occasions by President Lincoln for infiltrating Confederate exile organizations. This was an issue in which all Canadians were united and is a legitimate matter of national pride. The next major civil rights challenge that Canada had to face was that of the Metis, the mixed white and Indigenous people on the Great Plains. The territory of the natives had been steadily reduced by white settlement, and the nutritious content of their diet had been reduced by the heavy depletion of the herds of plains buffalo. There were also many other grievances and undoubtedly a number of violations of the Indian treaties and of the Indian Act. And a flamboyant Métis lawyer, Louis Riel, led an uprising on the Western Plains in 1878. This was eventually suppressed with little violence as the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, dispatched an adequate military force under Field Marshal Garnet Wolseley, Gilbert and Sullivan's very model of the modern Major General. Riel fled to the US, and the Canadian government made a number of useful concessions to the aggrieved natives. But in 1885, Riel returned and led a rebellion in northwest Saskatchewan. At the same time, the Canadian Pacific Railway ran out of money in mid-construction and was about to flounder into bankruptcy. Macdonald brilliantly sent Canadian forces west on the railway, and they surprised and defeated the insurgents and captured Riel. By emphasizing the railway's role in saving the country, as Riel was making both annexationist and secessionist noises, Macdonald won passage of a bill to finance completion of the railway. Macdonald also gave the natives the right to vote and rewarded his allies among the native leaders. He created a lasting grievance, however, by allowing the execution of Riel. Although 15 people died in the uprising, he should have commuted the sentence for insanity. Louis Riel was delusional. The claim we now face that, in effect, the white man in Canada has behaved toward a native culture that was equal to their own in the 17th century, with no more legality than Hitler and Stalin in their 1939 invasion of Poland, is an outrage. The natives were very skillful, but there were only about 200,000 of them in what is now Canada. They were almost all nomads in a Stone Age civilization, and they constantly conducted horrible wars against each other. With that said, there is no doubt that we have treated the natives shabbily and must do better. The Indian Act and the various treaties do not provide adequately for them. The rescission of the Harper government's requirement that the tribes and bands be administered acceptably according to Canadian governmental standards must be restored. And all natives who wish to assimilate to Canadian life must be more tangibly assisted to do so. Those who do not must be grouped in sufficiently large areas that they function as viable social milieu, unlike most reservations that often reduce their occupants to a demoralized state. There has been a great deal of arbitrary and dishonest government by some of the hereditary regimes within the native tribes and bands. In promoting the legitimate claims of the native population, we have inflicted a considerable injury on the civil rights of the well-intentioned and fair-minded majority of Canadians. The current federal government has presumed to declare that Canada is guilty of attempting some form of genocide on the natives. Every conceivable grievance, almost none of them intended by white administrators, has been magnified to portray the natives as the subjects of comprehensive Canadian national oppression, if not gradual or at least cultural extinction. The present federal government is engaged in a number of humbling acts of self-proclaimed guilt and shame that have embarrassed all Canadians, such as flying the Canadian flag on federal sites at half-mast everywhere in the world for months on end. We've made a ludicrous spectacle of ourselves and brought the country into needless disrepute in the world. I put it to you that the incompetence of the present government's doubtless well-intended effort to help the Indigenous has in some measure assaulted the civil rights of all Canadians, including the natives, not to be defamed. We will achieve nothing for the Indigenous by falsely smearing the principal founder of our country. Even in the time of Palmerston, Lincoln, Disraeli, Gladstone, and Bismarck, John A. Macdonald was seen as a great statesman, and it is oppressive to the majority in Canada that officially funded native groups liken Macdonald to Hitler, and that cowardly city councils and university faculties remove Macdonald's statue and erase his name. Wilfrid Laurier followed Macdonald and was a statesman of approximately equivalent stature. Laurier put the secular rights of Canadians ahead of ecclesiastical attachments in the setting up of Western schools, which caused him some problems with conservative Quebec clerics, but promoted a spirit of liberality in the country. He was always reliable in the defense of minorities, and when the Salvation Army proposed to lead parades that would go through very unilingual and almost ultramontanist Catholic communities, he dealt with the protesters by saying that he would, if necessary, lead the parades himself because of the right of all law-abiding groups to enjoy the benefits of freedom of expression and assembly. Laurier's greatest service was as leader of the opposition in 1917 in responding to the widespread English-Canadian demand for the imposition of conscription for the Great War on French Canadians, as they were not volunteering in the same numbers as English Canadians. Quebec was not inspired by any loyalty to the mother country, having been abandoned by France and dismissed by Voltaire as a few acres of snow. Laurier warned the Prime Minister, Robert Borden, that if he simply used his parliamentary majority to conscript French Canadians, he, Laurier, would lose the leadership of the French Canadians to Papineau's fiery grandson, Henri Bourassa, and Quebec would be waiting to secede. He said that if Borden held an election or referendum on the issue, he would win it, but it would be enough of a democratic process for Laurier to sustain Quebec's faith in federalism. And he also predicted privately that in the ensuing years, the Liberals would be very successful, and indeed, they won 7 elections and drew 1 and lost only 1 in the following 40 years. The Conservative Party has still not recovered from the avoidable disaster of conscription. In World War II, Mackenzie King gave a pledge of no conscription for overseas service and held to it despite a repetition of the agitation of many English Canadians and the senior military to impose conscription. King famously said, with his customary decisiveness, conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. He held a referendum in 1942 asking to be released from his pledge to avoid conscription. 66% of Canadians supported him, 80% of English Canadians, but 90% of French Canadians, who provided 40% of King's MPs, voted against. The division could not have been more stark. These English-French rights disputes have haunted us more recently, and I will get to them in a moment. In January 1942, in the most disreputable form of imitation of poor American public policy, 27,000 Japanese Canadians in British Columbia were subjected to seizure of their assets and forced removal to internment camps at least 100 miles inland from the Pacific coast, with grating restrictions on movement and activities. The trustees of alien assets, who was supposed to conserve and restore them, instead sold them in 1943 at knockdown prices. Some restitution was made shortly after the war, but not until Prime Minister Brian Mulroney in 1993 was the matter put to rights with $21,000 for each surviving detainee, restoration of citizenship to anyone deprived of it, and $36 million for Japanese Canadian institutions. It was a disgraceful episode, but no one was killed, injured, fined, or fully incarcerated, and after an unconscionable passage of time, there was substantial reparation. The principal civil rights abuses in Canada since World War II have all been traceable to the culturally ingrained difference in the approach to civil and human rights of the British and French traditions. The British concept defines rights as reposing with each individual, especially opposite governments and other powerful organizations. The French have proclaimed the rights of whole peoples. When Rousseau famously wrote that man is born free but is everywhere in chains, he was referring to mankind, not each man. In the French conception, the rights of individuals are automatically superseded by a collective imperative, an imminent domain for the general security and interests of the people as a whole. In Canada, the susceptibility to this form of reasoning is increased by the historic fear of French Canadians that they could be assimilated, deprived of their culture by the English-speaking majority in Canada and by the vast ocean of English-speaking people generally in North America. To the French and French Canadians, it is perfectly reasonable to apply undemocratic methods to curb anti-democratic political movements. This was the issue with the notorious Padlock Law of 1937 that finally drifted up to the Supreme Court of Canada 20 years later. The Padlock Law authorized the shutting down of buildings where communist propaganda was allegedly produced and the seizure of offensive printed propaganda. This law led to no incarcerations or significant fines. Of course, the Padlock Law was an outrageous measure, but it was essentially a publicity stunt, and it had a minimal impact on individuals. There was just a seizure of some pamphlets and minor inconvenience. An English-speaking appeal judge dissented that the law was ultra vires to the legislature of Quebec because communism was not defined and there was an absence of due process, and that it trespassed in the federal domain of criminal law and was a contravention of the Canada Elections Act. This was sustained at the Supreme Court by the English majority over the traditional Quebec view of collective rights taking precedence over individual rights, and that it was in the provincial constitutional jurisdiction of property and civil rights. It was not really a criminal statute. Somewhat similar issues were raised by what was flamboyantly described in the late 1940s and early 50s as Quebec's war on the Jehovah's Witnesses, which in fact chiefly consisted of revoking the liquor license of a Montreal restaurateur, Frank Roncarelli, who had posted bail for 393 of his fellow Jehovah's Witnesses. They had been arrested for violating municipal bylaws that prohibited the badgering of members of the public in public places and at their residential front doors to proselytize on behalf of their religious sect. Again, this issue got to the Supreme Court of Canada after over 10 years. The High Court determined that lifting Roncarelli's liquor license was an injustice inflicted on a man who was legally posting bail, over the French view that someone using a permit issued by the province to subsidize and facilitate repetitive civil lawbreaking was himself violating the terms of the license. The civil rights issue remains debatable. More serious and inextricably tied to the future of Canada is the Quebec language legislation that has steadily imposed limitations on all languages in Quebec except French. The government of Robert Bourassa in 1974 declared that French was the only official language in Quebec, opposed bilingualism in commercial signs, and required that in all signage within commercial establishments such as supermarkets, the lettering in French had to be larger than in any other language. Access to English language instruction was in many cases to be allowed only when preschool children passed tests indicating a greater aptitude to speak English than French. This last measure caused great resentment as putting pressure on very young children. and the concept arose of language police that was much mocked. There were many accounts of tourists, particularly Americans, asking that language police be identified. There was even curiosity about whether they had uniforms like Mounties. In 1977, Quebec's first overtly separatist government, led by Premier René Lévesque, further restricted the use of English and the access to English language education in the Quebec state school system. The Bourassa and Lévesque bills were both successfully attacked in Ottawa, but the relevant Supreme Court rulings were themselves voided by invocation of the notwithstanding clause of the 1982 Constitution that can be invoked in these cases to conserve the provincial jurisdiction and civil rights. This provision severely undermines the Charter of Rights and Freedoms attached to the 1982 Constitution. Hundreds of thousands of English-speaking people have departed Quebec since the adoption of Bourassa's Bill 22 in 1974. But the secularization of Quebec and a declining birth rate have reduced French Quebec's share of the Canadian population. This has been somewhat compensated for by French-speaking immigrants from Haiti, North Africa, and Lebanon. These people tend to be not much interested in Quebec nationalism and knew that they were moving to a mainly English-speaking continent. The provincial government does not currently speak much of separating, but can push its aggressive language agenda. The latest measure in this sequence is the current Bill 96, which will shrink the number of people attending English language schools and eliminates English as an official language in the Quebec offices and workplaces of the federal government and federally chartered corporations and institutions. This is unconstitutional, and it is shaming that all 5 federal political parties have rolled over like poodles and not uttered a peep of objection. It follows in the spirit of Quebec legislation prohibiting the wearing of religious objects or religiously specialized apparel that is deemed to be a conveyance of sectarian aggression or makes it impossible to identify a Muslim woman in public. This measure is justified by a public security requirement that everyone be capable of being identified in public. It also appeases a particular irritation in Quebec at Islamic symbolism, but it also seems related to a subtler and more historically profound sentiment of contemporary Quebec resentment of the centuries when Quebec was very heavily influenced by the Roman Catholic Church. That institution has thus gone full circle from the threat it was under at the time of the early British and American revolutionary hostility to it. Nationalist French Quebec's antipathy to the organization that secured the cultural survival of the French language for 175 years undoubtedly reveals profound psychological complexities in Quebec. In these circumstances, both language and religious liberties are under some threat in Quebec. What we might call administrative and political intrusion on rights is becoming steadily more annoying and worrisome, and not only in Quebec. My learned friend Jordan Peterson retired from the University of Toronto because of a controversy in which the administration was ambivalent about whether a minority of students could force him to address them according to a vocabulary that they had applied to themselves in reference to altered sexual self-identification. Of course, this concept violates liberty of expression. The truckers this past winter had just grievances against the COVID regime and were peaceful protesters, yet they were suppressed under the Emergencies Act on the theory that they were creating a public order emergency. An attempt by some truckers to block traffic at border points had to be stopped by normal police action. Parking trucks in downtown Ottawa does not constitute a public order emergency. That could have been alleviated without recourse to draconian legislation. The effective co-prime minister, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, wait for it, declared, I'm quoting him, "It is clear that this is not a protest. It is an act to try to overthrow the government, and it is funded by foreign interference, and we must stop that flow of foreign interference, particularly from the United States. The convoys are led by those that claim the superiority of the white bloodline and equate Islam to a disease," end quote. Prime Minister Trudeau and the truckers were still hundreds of miles away, said that they were homophobes, misogynists, and white supremacists. All of these reflections from the highest elected officials in the country were disgraceful, defamatory, unfounded lies. The scandalous detention and isolation for 18 days of Tamara Leach was a grave breach of civil liberty. In the spurious name of climate change, about which we know very little, economic warfare is conducted against the oil and gas producing regions of the country and that entire economic sector. Higher energy costs, lower income for the fossil fuel industry, since they are not based on real scientific probabilities, are not really acceptable consequences of legitimate public policy positions. They are infringements upon the civil and economic rights of citizens. Our healthcare system Our healthcare system, of which Canadians remain inexplicably proud, it is arbitrarily rationing healthcare and is stunted by an inadequate number of doctors, much of it due to the persecution of private medicine. And our healthcare systems are now reduced to the shame and indignity of promoting assisted suicide as death with dignity that incidentally, if widely enough practiced, would bring down healthcare costs along with our life expectancy. Healthcare systems are supposed to promote life, not death. Perhaps the greatest irony of recent public policy in this and in all other advanced Western countries is that we spend more and more on education and yet have less and less well-educated graduates at almost every level. It is clear from the irresponsible behavior of our teachers' unions, repeatedly blackmailing parents with strike threats, that they have little interest in the welfare of their students. They are largely conducting daycare centers with a sprinkling of rudimentary academic instruction, and extensive surveys reveal a steady decline in the education level of graduates. Our university system tyrannizes anyone who is not a proponent of the mass fictions that we live in a racist and inadequately Marxist society. We and other countries are impoverishing ourselves, graduating an immense horde of university students in fields which cannot possibly generate a survivable income for them. Our universities are unemployment deferral projects. They are dumbed down infestations of under-challenged students, underworked and often subversive faculty imparting expertise in esoteric subjects. Jordan Peterson is correct when he says that no subject ending in the word studies has any academic standing. Where the schools are in the hands of the robotic left and focused largely on the study of irrelevant disciplines, we are certain to get, as we have, steadily less responsible and reliable media. Almost all distinction between reporting and comment has been abandoned in our media, and what passes for news more often is simply the leftist philistinism of unrigorous reporters peddling faddish bile free of any pretense of impartiality. I know, I employed another one. Usually it isn't very well written or spoken either. As objective tests of our secondary school graduates reveal steadily lower standards of achievement, so public opinion polling indicates that a steadily smaller percentage of the public trusts the media. Our media are so chronically mediocre and frequently dishonest that what should be in a rich and free country like this, the civil right to a reasonably high standard of media information, is a general denial of that right. These contemporary threats to civil rights have the unusual characteristic of a civil right denied to the population by the indifference and insipidity of the population itself. Just as the English language majority in the country seems determined not to be concerned about Quebec's attempted strangulation of the English language in that province, it is apparently indifferent to the worthless inadequacy of most of the media that serves it. The public is right to distrust and even despise the media, but that breeds indifference to a free press, which is essential to democracy. What we are witnessing, if it continues, is the gradual civic suicide of a society of rights. This can be reversed, and usually where there is not excessive physical coercion by the state, it is reversed. That is primarily what the Democracy Fund is trying to assist. If we and other like-minded people and organizations are not successful in this, then Canada's long and distinguished history of upholding civil rights will end in a welter of authoritarian regulations and imposed political bigotry and misinformation. The civil rights record of Canada from when it first had the slightest influence on its own governance, and for the last 260 years, has been one of the most creditable of any country in the world. Such a rich country as this, with such a distinguished history, and so fortunate in the competence and liberality of its population, will surely avoid the grim fate that is now starting to threaten us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Conrad. It's I'm a little embarrassed to say that I learned more about the history of Canada from your speech than I learned in 13 years in that very expensive education system you mentioned. So my parents will be very grateful to you. In the spirit of keeping the conversation open and not just us speaking, but also hearing from you, we invited questions for Mr. Black from some of the ticket holders. Some very interesting ones came in, and because we're short on time, I'm going to try to sort of summarize the essence of what I think are some of the more sort of the interesting, poignant questions. One thing I think people are quite concerned about is property rights. Now, with very good reason. Is the federal government correct, do you think, in their recent claims that Canadians do not have an absolute right to personal property. And there seems to be a sort of an ideological atmosphere surrounding.
You see, this goes back to the constitutional controversy following the first Quebec referendum. And Pierre Trudeau undertook to patriate the amending mechanism for the Constitution and add the Charter of Rights. And the only way he could get it through was NDP support. And that party was then led by Ed Broadbent, a very nice man who's MP from Oshawa. And the Liberal Party dutifully repeated the tradition in Canada of saying property rights were protected. And the NDP said that conditional upon their support, that clause had to be dropped. So it was dropped. Now, you can criticize Trudeau or not. He felt he had to do that to get the whole measure through, and he needed to get it through in order to reply properly to the Quebec voters who had rejected the separatists. But that's how it happened, and we're stuck with it. Now, I think that should be changed. I think it could be changed. I think it was properly presented. You could get a change that most Canadians want property protected, but you're right, it isn't. So leftist politicians can play around with it, and they do.
And there's this idea, isn't there, that, well, you're going to give us your property, you won't own anything, and you will be happy, by the way. I don't know if that claim is just descriptive or if it's normative as well. You better be happy, by the way.
Yeah, I even our leftist friends have got to be careful with that one.
Yeah.
We're all a little bit like John Locke's squirrel, you know, we like to put away a little more than we need, maybe.
That's all the time we have, I'm told. You'll have to come back again and we'll have a further conversation. But I want to thank you so much, Mr. Black. Thank you for sharing your insight with us. I think in order to, you have to have an awfully comprehensive sense of the history of anything and of our country in particular in order to be able to pull back from it and see the markers of civil liberties defense in the way that you have. And so I thank you for that. Thank you all for being here tonight, whether you're here in person or watching us by Zoom. And please don't forget that, you know, we shouldn't give up principles of liberty, even when it seems like no one cares about them, because that's precisely when we need liberty the most. And please stay relentless, stay yourself, and come back for more sometime. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.